There are no entries on the Africans overseas. There is no such category. Africans who have been raped from the continent mysteriously disappear and become Negroes.
Friends, if you have ever wondered why Africa, a continent so rich in land, gold, oil, and human talent, remains described as underdeveloped, then this episode is for you. Because the man we're about to talk about was not just a historian. He was a revolutionary voice who stood up and said, Africa is poor because it was made poor. His name was Walter Rodney, a brilliant scholar from Guyana who only at 30 years old wrote a book that shook the world, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. A book so sharp, so uncompromising that it was banned in several countries, yet it became a Bible for freedom fighters from Accra to Dar es Salaam. But Rodney was not just sitting in a library turning pages. He was out in the street, speaking to workers, peasants, and students. He believed history was not for classrooms. It was for the people, and the argument he made in 1972 turned the tables on centuries of excuses. He said underdevelopment was not an accident, no natural misfortune. It was a direct result of Europe's deliberate exploitation of Africa. And here's the twist: while his analyses were brilliant, his solutions would prove far more complicated, even flawed. That tension between Rodney's story inside and his misplaced hope is what makes his story so urgent today. Welcome to another episode of Afrinometry. Since you're here, please kindly share and subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Walter Rodney was born in 1942 in Georgetown, Guyana, into a modest working class family. His father was a tailor, his mother a homemaker. They didn't have wealth, but they gave him something more enduring: discipline, education, and a sense that the struggles of ordinary people mattered. From the very beginning, Rodney was not sheltered. He saw poverty up close, and he carried that awareness like a compass. By the time he was in high school, his brilliance was unmistakable. He won a scholarship to study at the University of West Indies in Jamaica, and later, as one of the brightest minds of his generation, he traveled to England, where he earned his PhD in African history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, at just the age of 24 years old. His thesis on the slave trade in the Upper Guinea coast was not just academic. It tore open the polite lies of colonial historiography and exposed the brutality and economic engineering behind slavery. But what made Rodney different from most scholars was this: he refused to keep his knowledge locked up in classrooms. While others debated in ivory towers, Rodney went into the neighborhoods and marketplaces. In Jamaica, in 1968, he became famous for holding what he called groundings. He sat with the poor, with Rastafarians, with the unemployed, teaching history and politics in plain language. He argued that true education must empower the oppressed, not flatter the elite. He terrified those in power. The Jamaican government banned him from re-entering the country after he attended a conference abroad, sparking protests known as the Rodney Riots. Imagine that for a moment. A young historian was igniting demonstrations that shook Kingston's to its core. This will be the dream of almost every historian throughout history. This was Rodney before How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. A man already convinced that knowledge without action was betrayal. A man who believed history should not just explain the world, but change it. When Walter Rodney published How Europe Underdeveloped Africa in 1972, it was not just another academic book, it was a weapon. Its pages carried a fire, and for many Africans, it named something they had always felt but could not fully articulate: that poverty in Africa was not natural, nor was it the fault of Africans themselves. It was engineered. Rodney's central claim was brutally simple: Europe did not merely develop while Africa stagnated. Europe developed because Africa was underdeveloped. The prosperity of London, Paris, and Lisbon was built on the broken backs of African labor and the extraction of African wealth. He took his readers on a journey through history. First, the transatlantic slave trade, which ripped millions of Africans from their homelands, drained the continent of its strongest and most productive people. While African societies lost generations, European ports grew rich and European industry thrived. Then came colonialism in the 19th century. The so-called scramble for Africa was nothing more than a systemic looting operation. European power seized land, imposed taxes, and forced Africans into cash crops economies: cotton, cocoa, coffee, not to feed African mouths, but to supply European factories. And even when railroads, schools, or hospitals were built, Rodney argued they were never for Africa's benefit. The railways led not from village to village, but from mine to port, so gold and copper could be shipped overseas. The school produced clerks, not innovators. The hospitals served colonial administrators before they served ordinary Africans. In Rodney's words, these so-called developments were designed to tighten dependency, not to foster independence. What made Rodney's argument devastating was that he stripped away excuses. Colonial apologists love to say, But look at the roads, look at the telegraphs, look at the cities we built. Rodney answered them directly. These were not gifts, they were instruments of exploitation. Finally, he exposed what he called the myth of African backwardness. For centuries, Europeans had insisted that Africa was primitive, that it had no history, no civilization, no contribution to the modern world. Rodney demolished that lie by pointing to flourishing African kingdoms, Mali, Songhai, Benin, Great Zimbabwe, and to the advanced systems of trade, governance, and culture that existed long before European arrival. The brilliance of Rodney's book was not just in its scholarship, it was in its accessibility. He wrote with clarity, with urgency, so that his words could reach beyond the lecture halls and into the hands of workers, students, and activists. To read how Europe underdeveloped Africa in the 1970s was to feel both enraged and awakened. It was the diagnosis of colonialism's crime and cultural resistance. When How Europe Underdeveloped Africa appeared in 1972, its impact was electric. In an age where many African nations were barely a decade past independence, Rodney's words gave shape to frustrations that were simmering across the continent.
And because of this, we have a problem of identification. We do not know whom we are. And that is why this gathering is of great symbolic importance, because it is an act of identification.
The flags had changed, the national anthems were new, but the economic structures often looked eerily the same. Resources flowing outward, poverty remaining at home. Rodney's book spoke directly to this reality. In Tanzania, where he was teaching at the University of Dar es Salaam, students devoured it, passing on copies from hand to hand. It became almost a manifesto for the radical intelligentsia, those who wanted not only political freedom, also economic break with the old colonial order. Beyond Tanzania, traveled quickly. In Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa, activists found in Rodney a language to link their own struggles to a global pattern of exploitation. For South African anti-apartheid fighters, his insistence that underdevelopment was intentional resonated deeply. Apartheid itself was another form of engineered poverty. But the influence did not stop in Africa. Across the Caribbean, Rodney became a lightning rod. In his native Guyana, he was celebrated by the working class and fed by the political elite. His ideas helped fuel movements that demanded racial justice, workers' rights, and genuine independence from neocolonial influence. The ruling establishment saw him as a threat, and his growing popularity put him under constant surveillance. Even further afield in Britain and the United States, Rodney's work became a cornerstone of the emerging field of black studies. For young black students navigating universities where histories were being ignored or erased, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa was proof that their past was rich, complex, and systematically distorted by colonial narratives. Rodney's influence was not just intellectual, it was profoundly political. He rejected the idea of the detached academic. For him, scholarship was a weapon to be used in the fight for liberation. This conviction cost him dearly. In 1968, after attending a conference in Montreal, Rodney returned to Jamaica and delivered fiery speeches criticizing the government's betrayal of the poor.
Nobody else gives somebody else freedom. Freedom is something for which you fight, and then you win. If someone gives it to you as a gift, it is not really freedom.
The Jamaican authorities banned him from re-entering the country. The students erupted in protest, sparking what became known as the Rodney Riots. The clashes left several people dead and marked Rodney as a revolutionary thinker who could move masses, not just lecture halls. By the mid-1970s, Rodney had become more than a historian. He was a symbol of uncompromising truth-telling, a man who dared to correct past exploitation with present injustice. His ideas traveled across borders because they answered the burning question of the era. Why, after the end of colonial rule, did Africa remain poor while Europe remained rich? Walter Rodney's brilliance lay in his diagnosis. Few have explained with such clarity how colonialism did not simply happen to Africa, but was designed to drain its wealth. Yet when it came to solutions, Rodney's vision was less enduring. Rooted in Marxist thought, he believed socialism offered Africa a path to escape dependency. He imagined state-led planning, collective agriculture, and industrialization under strong centralized government. In the early 1970s, this seemed plausible. Across the continent, liberation leaders were proclaiming that only socialism could restore dignity to societies ravaged by centuries of exploitation. History, however, has shown the limits of this prescription. From Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana in the 1960s to Julius Nyerere's Tanzania in the 1970s, many African states experimented with socialist models. Nkrumah poured resources into massive state industries, hoping to leapfrog Ghana into modernity. Instead, corruption, debt, and inefficiency sank his grand project. By 1966, he was overthrown in a coup d'etat. Nyerere's famous Ujama villages, designed to build collective life on African communal traditions, initially inspired global admiration. Yet by the late 1970s, they faced food shortages, resistance from farmers, and mounting economic stagnation. Other leaders followed similar paths. Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia Samora Machel in Mozambique, and later Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. Each sought to break with capitalism by turning to state-driven socialism. But again and again, the results fell short, bureaucracies bloated, economies stalled, black markets thrived, and ordinary people bore the cost. Rodney's faith in the Soviet Union as model also proved misplaced. In the early 1970s, the Soviet system looked formidable, appearing to rival the West in industry, science, and military power. To many African radicals, it seemed a natural ally. Yet by the 1980s, the cracks were undeniable. Shortages, inefficiency, and authoritarianism followed out the Soviet project. By 1991, the entire system collapsed. The dream that socialism, imported wholesale, would rescue Africa died with it. Even before the Cold War ended, Africa's experiment with socialism revealed another weakness in Rodney's vision: his underestimation of how deeply colonial structures had scarred the continent. It was not enough to replace private companies with state-owned ones, or to redistribute land by decree. Centuries of economic distortions, fragile institutions, and entrenched elites meant that any top-down system, whether capitalist or socialist, risks capture by those in power. None of this diminishes the brilliance of Rodney's critique. He was right that colonialism engineered dependency and extracted wealth. He was right that political independence without economic transformation was hollow. But his error was in believing that socialism led by centralized state could erase centuries of structural inequality in a generation. The reality proved far harsher. By the late 1970s, Walter Rodney was no longer simply a historian. He was a political force. His writings had electrified students in Dar es Salaam to Kingston, but now his greatest battle was at home, in Guyana. Guyana in the 1970s was a nation deeply divided along racial and political lines. The ruling party under Forbes Bonham had consolidated power and built what many describe as a repressive authoritarian state. Elections were rigged, dissent was silenced, and opposition voices were crushed. For Bonham, a man who had once spoken the language of liberation, power itself became the end. Rodney returned to Guyana in 1974, not as a radical professor in exile, but as a man determined to build a movement. With his allies, he founded the Working People's Alliance, a multiracial political party that sought to unite Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese under a common cause: democracy, justice, and equality. It was a bold gamble in a country where politics had long been poisoned by ethnic rivalry. Rodney's charisma and intellect made him a natural leader. He spoke not from an ivory tower, but the language of the workers, farmers, and the poor. Crowds gathered to hear him speak, and he quietly became the most credible threat Bonham holds on power. This made him a madman. The regime unleashed machinery of repression. The Blue PA activists were harassed, beaten, and arrested. Bonham's party-controlled unions and security forces turned against Rodney and his allies. Yet Rodney refused to be silenced. He believed that true freedom required not only independence from Britain, but liberation from authoritarianism of local elites. That defiance came at a price. On the night of June 13, 1980, Walter Rodney climbed into his brother's car in Georgetown to test a walkie-talkie he had been given. What he did not know was that the device had been rigged to explode. When he pressed the button, the car was blown apart. Rodney was killed instantly at only 38 years old. The news sent shockwaves across the world. The government claimed it was an accident, but few believed them. Years later, inquiries and testimonies confirmed what many suspected. Rodney had been assassinated, almost certainly with the complicity of the Bonham regime. His death robbed the Caribbean, Africa, and the wider world one of his sharpest minds. Yet in dying so young, Rodney joined the tragic pantheons of figures whose lives were cut short but whose ideas lived on. His assassination did not erase his message. If anything, it ensured his words carried even greater weight. In that moment, Rodney became more than a scholar or a political activist. He became a symbol of courage against tyranny, of resistance against injustice, and of the high price paid by those who dare to tell the truth in societies built on lies. Walter Rodney may have died in 1980, cut down at just 38 years old, but his voice has outlived the regimes that silenced him. More than 4 decades later, his words continue to echo across Africa, the Caribbean, and the wider Black world. Why? Because the questions he raised are still with us. Africa may no longer be under formal colonial rule, but debates about neocolonialism, about trade imbalances, resource extraction, debt, and exploitation remain as urgent as ever. When people speak about how foreign companies control Africa's minerals, or how the continent's resources enrich others while Africans struggle, they are speaking in Rodney's language. His warning that independence without economic transformation will be hollow rings throughout every generation. In the Caribbean, his name inspires movement for social justice. In Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad, activists remember the man who grounded with ordinary people, who believed that scholarship must serve the poor. Across the Atlantic, in African universities, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa remains required reading, not just as history, but as a living critique of global inequality. Rodney's legacy also survives in the way he combined intellectual rigor with activism. He refused to separate knowledge from struggle. That commitment is perhaps his greatest gift, reminding us that history is not a museum piece, but a weapon for the present. And yet, Rodney's story is also a caution. His faith in Soviet-style socialism showed the limits of imported imported models. His solution did not allow the Cold War. That does not erase the value of his work. If anything, it shows that diagnosis and critique are easier than prescriptions. That Africa's path must be forged on its own terms, not copied wholesale from abroad. In the end, Dr. Rodney matters because he demanded honesty. He stripped away the lies of colonial propaganda and insisted on truth, no matter how uncomfortable. He matters because he believes that dignity begins with knowledge, and that the people who understand their past cannot be enslaved by falsehood about their present. Rodney's life was cut short, but his example endures. Courage in scholarship, courage in politics, courage and loyalty to the people. That, more than any theory or policy, is his enduring legacy. Thank you for watching this episode.